Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion. I'm one of your moderators, Sujong Ka, an artist, organizer, researcher, and fellow at NYU's Asian Pacific American Institute, which generously co-sponsored this event along with the NYC Book Tour Bars, like Daddy's at the back, who actually represent the organization, and then ARCO, which is an art organization. Um,
And I'm Sue's co-moderator, Kim Bobier. I'm an art historian and professor at Pratt Institute. And as we introduce our panel, we should also acknowledge the ground on which we meet, the unceded ancestral homeland and territory of the Lenape people. Tonight, as we consider U.S. publication censorship, its context and biases, let's remember the indigenous dispossession that underlies the vibrant New York City institutions and infrastructures allowing us to gather here tonight. Let's remember that oppression is intersectional and fighting it necessitates an investment in understanding the histories and ongoing consequences of settler colonialism, as well as empowering contemporary indigenous communities.
Speaking of the ground on which we meet, I'm grateful to have this event in such a historic venue, the Jefferson Market Library, especially because its particular history is relevant to this evening's discussion. Until 1945, this site was a courthouse whose basement connected to the Women's House of Detention. Notorious for incarcerating sexually and economically marginalized women and transmasculine people, this women's prison operated from 1932 to 1974. During Angela Davis's stint here in 1970, he shared her books with others behind bars. Under brutal circumstances, Davis formed a community through books, activities through books, and conversations through books. This is what the library does for us tonight. This collective exchange wouldn't be possible without support from Frank Corellius, manager of the library. He is actually downstairs. He should be at the desk. Who always opened the door for radical caring and community-oriented events. To me, he extends Angela Davis's legacy of generosity.
And in this vein, Dear Readers Beyond Bars, Banned Manga, and Explicitness in U.S. Prison Censorship is a panel discussion for building a community of care through exchange. This exchange will be geared toward exploring how U.S. publication censorship interacts with and infringes on people's rights as well as their horizons. While tackling these broader issues, we'll emphasize a highly targeted publication type, manga. Manga makes a compelling case study because bans on it bring together a lot of salient issues when it comes to censorship. Censorship of visual materials and sexually explicit ones, cross-cultural and racial perceptions in censorship, along with censorship in educational and carceral systems. And here to talk about all these topics and share their insights, we have esteemed panelists. So first I'll go ahead and introduce Paul Wright, who is the founder and executive director of the Human Rights Defense Center. He's also editor of Prison Legal News, the longest running independent prisoner rights publication in the US. A former prisoner, Paul was imprisoned for 17 years in Washington State until his release in 2003. During and since his incarceration, he has successfully litigated a wide variety of censorship and public records cases against prison systems nationwide. Paul is a former military policeman, a graduate of the University of Maryland with a degree in Soviet history, and the former National Lawyers Guild jailhouse lawyer, co-vice president from 1995 to 2008. He's earned numerous accolades and awards. So I'll just mention that more recently, in 2018, he received the Frederick Douglass Award from the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives and the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University in Washington, D.C. He serves as the National Vice President of the National Police Accountability Project.
Jeff Trexler is an experienced transactional and civil litigation attorney, ethics advisor, and crisis manager with the focus on creative industries, including media, fashion, and comics, as well as all types of nonprofit organizations. He has taught law for over 2 decades, including creating and continuing to teach the fashion ethics course at Fordham Law School, as well as courses at Yale Law School, SMU, Pace University, and St. Louis University. He has been part of dozens of panels at continuing legal education programs, Comic-Cons, and nonprofit and social enterprise events in the US and across the world. He is a member of the advisory board of the Fashion Law Institute and previously served as its associate director, where his work on ethics issues included advising government officials and companies on sexual harassment, legal reform, anti-corruption, sustainability, and diversity and inclusion issues. He is also a member of the ethics committee at Currying Americas and serves on the board of the Museum of Comics and Cartoon Art. He holds a JD from the Yale Law School and PhD in American Religious History from Duke University.
And Renee Scott, aka the Library Lady, is a senior young adult librarian for the New York Public Library, as well as a reviewer for School Library Journal's blog, Good Comics for Kids. A dedicated otaku and gamer, Renee is a lifelong fan of comics, anime, and manga. She uses her love and knowledge of manga to promote literacy and socio-emotional learning among the youth in her community. Renee has spoken at various events and panels, continuing her work promoting the importance of manga. In addition to her work as a young adult librarian, Renee currently serves as a member of the New York Public Library's 2023 Best Books for Teens Committee, as well as a hub librarian for NYPL's College and Career Pathways, where she assists young adults in finding and achieving their desired path in life. Heavy lift. Great. So we're really excited to be in conversation with all of these panelists and to ask them questions. And we're also excited for you to engage the panelists. So if you're moved to pose a question, don't hesitate to raise your hand and add your voice to the mix. And that holds for all of our conversation. And then I will also say that towards the end of the panel, we'll try to reserve at least 30 minutes or so for questions, kind of Q&A then between panelists and audience members. And with that, I think we'll dive into the questions that we have for the panelists.
Let me start the first question. First of all, I want to just quickly explain about why manga, and then why it has been banned in American prisons a lot. I want to believe it's partially because xenophobic direction, but we can discuss it later on with the in-depth questions. And the first question I prepare is manga as a comics and graphic novel authored by East Asian is a complex form of visual and verbal storytelling associated with the East Asian culture. And we've been fascinated by how the censorship category of sexual explicitness is disproportionately applied to manga in the US, and then especially in the prison and public school education context. Now, we are curious to hear about the situations where you are encountered manga censorship or the censorship of other visual material associated with sexual content. What stands out to you about this censorship cases or the charges raised in them?
Hi. I think that one of the things, the easiest thing to say about prison censorship and also jail censorship is that basically the people, this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, but the people running prisons and jails tend to be somewhat authoritarian and fairly reactionary in their outlook. And one of the things I think that often gets underestimated is the fact that a huge percentage of the people running prisons and jails in this country are evangelical Christians. And I think, is everyone here familiar with the Westboro Baptist Church? This is a group of Baptists in Kansas. They're the ones who go around with the God Hates Facts signs. And they've litigated the issue of their First Amendment rights all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. But what's less known is the fact that they're all lawyers, and just about all of them are employed by prisons and jails in Kansas. And so these are the people that you've got making censorship decisions over what people in their custody can or cannot read. And my observation as they're doing this stuff for around 30 years is that what's most endangered is minority speech, and it's minority everything. Minority religions, racial minorities, sexual minorities, and then on top of that, and political minorities as well. And then on top of that, I'd say if you throw in almost any sexual content or any type of sexual speech, that's also on the hit list to be censored as well. And what's kind of bad about this is the fact that you've got government employees with a lot of discretion that the Supreme Court has given them to censor stuff. They don't have to present much in the way of evidence or give much of a reason for censoring it. And it's almost like they're given carte blanche to impose their own personal prejudices and beliefs upon the people in their captivity. And then even on the rare occasions people do sue them, even when the prisoners do win or the publishers do win, they're not suffering any consequences for it. And I say this in the context of the Human Rights Defense Center. I think over the last 30 plus years or so, we've won, we're closing in on over 100 censorship cases that we have won all over the country. We've taken on the biggest prison systems in the country, including California, Texas, and others. These states have paid millions of dollars in attorney's fees to our lawyers, as well as in damages, and they still keep doing it. And this is one of the things where there's really not a lot of downside for them to do so. And I think that one of the things that when you start seeing the censorship stuff like the censorship of Manga, this is also in the context that they're censoring a lot of stuff. If you look at some of the states that publish these banned book lists, which Sue has also been documenting, a number of years ago, we started filing public records requests to see what's on these banned book lists. And it ranges from everything from books by Barack Obama to books by Toni Morrison, stuff that's pretty mainstream. They really don't like Men's Health for some reason. They don't like Rolling Stone. They've really got it in for the guitar magazines. And you read this stuff. I mean, we got a bunch of these on the Prison Legal News website. So you have to if you just do a Google search for prison banned book list, and you find this. I mean, when you see that there's thousands and thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of censored books, you see kind of the broad-ranging sweep of police state censorship in the United States. So I think that's kind of the overall context you have to view this in. One of the ones that's really bizarre to me is one of the ones that the courts have upheld, the censorship of Dungeons and Dragons. And police or prison officials have upheld this, and the courts have bought it, is that somehow prisoners are engaged in Dungeons and Dragons in prison, that somehow this is a metaphor, a substitute for gang activity. And I'll say this, I was in prison for 17 years. The same guys that are playing Dungeons and Dragons in prison are the same bunch of nerds that were playing it in high school. These guys are not gang members. They're not, they just want to play their D&D and do their time and go home. They're not, these aren't the foot soldiers of the Mexican Mafia or the Aryan Brotherhood. And, but this is kind of like the hostility to any type of minority expression. And you see this across the board. Any type of sexual content is being stigmatized and censored, and anything that challenges the status quo. And I can say this, when I was in prison, I mean, I filed lawsuits over the censorship of everything from law books, communist literature, those were all stuff that I filed suits on that. I challenged the Washington Department of Corrections ban on sexually explicit material as well. We lost that one. But across the board, it's been, you've seen this kind of overwhelming desire to censor anything that isn't, and it's not even like mainstream speech, because even the mainstream speech kind of get censored as well. So when you see this, when you're seeing that, books by Barack Obama are being censored, Nobel Prize winners for literature, these are being censored. And so I think that's kind of like the overall context that, you have to look at things. And I think that one of the things that kind of the bigger overarching thing is they're really hostile towards anything around civil rights, human rights, anything that questions, much less attacks the police state. And I think that that's one of the things is that, if you're a government official, well, not just a government official, I see, maybe it's a human nature thing. No one likes to be criticized, or most people don't like to be criticized. And I think if you've got the ability to shut down your critics and shut them up and shut them down, it takes a lot of character and a lot of wisdom to refrain from using that. And unfortunately, no one running our prisons and jails in this country seems to have either one of those. And the courts, which are the ones that are supposed to be the ones that are supposed to enforce the ability of the common citizenry to criticize or critique or question our government, the police state, for the most part, they're pretty asleep at the switch on this. When you've got the Supreme Court saying that prison officials are supposed to be given a lot of deference when it comes to their decision-making on prison censorship issues. And that's led to kind of an abysmal situation. So I say that's kind of like, I think, the broad overview of the censorship, and I think Manga is just one small piece of that overall trend towards censoring anything that's minority. And and the people doing it, there's very little downside or incentive for them not to do it.
I just agree with everything, but but I just gotta speak, especially as a public librarian standpoint, because now we're getting targeted. And we have librarians getting arrested just for providing these materials. And it's ridiculous. And even having our lives threatened for providing said materials. So it's very scary this day and age right now, especially with manga and communities of color. We're seeing our stories in these manga that we hardly would see even in Western media. I have teens that are like, I relate to Naruto because I was bullied, I was alone, I was orphaned, and that's getting targeted. Dragon Ball, someone trying to achieve the best, that's being targeted. And even Pokemon's targeted for religious reasons. Figure that out. Figure that out. It makes no sense, not for animal cruelty or gambling, religious reasons. So it just makes no sense. And I think it's just that there is such a fear of the unknown, or it's like, I can't relate to this, but other people are being more aware of what's going on. It's like, wow, these marginalized communities have been attacked for so long, and now that they're getting their voice, we have to try to silence it. And it's just so ridiculous just to take it away from, especially from our youth who are trying to discover who they are, and they're not gonna be held in this little box that you're gonna try to put them in. And it's just sad to see that, especially with manga, which is popular. It's like anything that's popular, let's attack it, and it just makes no sense.
Hi. One of the things that a lot of people have commented on over the past couple of years is the role of the number of challenges against graphic novels and manga, right? There have been challenges against books that are in text form, but one of the things that we have seen at the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund is that manga and graphic novels really are the heart. And that is because I think the iconic nature of these books, all right? They are pictures. They show they don't just tell a story, but in some almost mysterious but all too human way, people see these images on the page as somehow representative of the community for good or for bad, and particularly they're seeing this in terms of change. They're seeing some major change. So what we've seen in the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund is there have been several trends that have affected censorship of comics and manga. One, of course, is the integration of graphic novels and manga into the education system. People now teach through comics and graphic novels They are in public libraries. They're everywhere. They're unavoidable. Something that many people had seen as juvenile is now everywhere and is taken seriously. And in a real sense, it's the future of American literacy. You know, we're moving away from just pure text. You have to understand how images and text work. We also have the internationalization of comics. And so you're seeing comics with different cultural backgrounds. And the big thing in terms of what comics depict is the revolution we have seen in civil rights. We have a deepened understanding of the consequences that gave rise to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the continuing effects of discrimination. And then we also have the radical, and I mean by radical, from the root. You know, it is a from top to bottom revision of civil rights law with respect to the LGBTQ community, which, you know, when I was in law school, the Supreme Court said you could arrest somebody, you could throw them in jail for having same-sex activity. And it's just 20 years ago when the Supreme Court reversed that and then started recognizing rights for gay rights. And just 3 years ago, recognizing rights for diverse gender expression and recognizing civil rights protection in the employment context for same-sex activity and LGBTQ identity. So when comics come in and depict this, people get a little bit scared, again, with this iconic nature. And so the attacks, you can put them on 3 levels. One is they're the kind of attacks where people would be upset about content no matter what form it's in. So they're just people who don't like LGBTQ content. If it's in text, if it's race content in text, it's just out. Then there are people, and there's a lot of them, and they're legislators and prosecutors, and people are challenging books in libraries. They see the comics as, they see particularly images of certain types of behavior as problematic. So there may be something where, it's like with The Handmaid's Tale or The Diary of Anne Frank, the text version remains, but the graphic novel form is banned. And so, or they may have a number of books that have LGBTQ themes in text, but the comics get attacked. And then the third level is all comics and all manga are bad. And we've seen a lot of this. Just in the past couple weeks, we've had people come to this comic book legal defense fund for help because their school's saying all manga have to be removed. That the whole medium, you know, is somehow, by its very nature, subliterate, juvenile, in the worst sense, and suffused with sex. There's just this sense that all manga is sex. And it's something that we're seeing in schools and libraries nationwide as a real threat. So that's what we're trying to fight, and I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all those thoughts with us, and I think all of your responses are really nice because they give us a sense of different contexts into which this discussion filters. And thinking about context, and we'll pick up on a lot of the specific threads too that you offered, but in thinking of context, all of you have experience working with censorship in the educational system and or the carceral one. So just to think about those a bit would be great. And when it comes to censorship, what have you each observed about these systems, particularities, and or connections between these systems, whatever resonates with you? And I think also just because this mic seems to be a little bit more forceful than that one, we'll switch with you. So I'll pass those over and we can swap.
I think we're swapping.
There we go.
Yeah. Little choreography.
Let me take a look at that. One of the things that came to mind when I was thinking about this question was, when you're a little kid, I think all of us have this experience where we go to school and we think of it as a prison. And in a way, you were right, because legally, schools and prisons are parts of our society where courts have said you don't enjoy the full protection of the First Amendment. Okay? So they're just different. It manifests itself in slightly different ways. Like, for example, in prisons, a regulation of speech, so a ban on manga totally or against specific books, has to have some rational relation to a penological purpose, right? And has and it has to have a rational relation to the particular type of regulation, like getting rid of explicit material or nudity. Whereas in the school context, they're thinking about managing a school, managing an education. Now, with respect to the prison context and the school context, one of the things that we have found, not just in jurisprudence, but practically, because we get a lot of letters from prisoners, is one big difference in, and is what Paul mentioned, in the jail context, prison context, the thumb really is on the scale against the challenge by the prisoner. There's a sense, there really is a sense that more often than not, a court is going to look at a challenge and go, well, I think there's a rational interest there towards rehabilitation, towards maintaining order in the prison, that sort of thing. And historically, in schools, and in school libraries, there's been the sense where the court's like, well, we want to be give it a little bit of a hedge here. We give administrators a lot of leeway in the curriculum, but in the library, we don't want librarians excluding books on the basis of ideology. And so these two phrases occur, is it educationally unsuitable or is it pervasively vulgar? So those sort of standards have emerged in terms of reasons to keep a book out of the library. And this is where the scales of justice might be changing a little bit, because we've seen pressure in the past 3 years on courts, and I represented Maya Kobe, the author of Genderqueer, in an attempt to find genderqueer obscene in the state of Virginia. We're seeing pressure to say, wait a second, let's make it more likely to find these books obscene. Let's invent standards that don't even require them to be obscene. So in a way, there's almost a growing convergence between prisons and schools in terms of the ability to challenge certain works.
Again, with public libraries, we have like a little bit more leeway because we're providing entertainment as well. And also, like, we have readers who are like, all right, I'm dating myself here. Because if anyone remembers the 4Kids era or the Toonami era, when it was aired in the afternoon, which was heavily, I see you, how it was heavily edited when it first came to American shores. So now we have the work that's like, and also we have sites like HDive and Crunchyroll, which shows it in its original format. So you'll see, especially with Dragon Ball, how you don't see the blood. You don't see like the gaping hole in Goku's chest. That's what it was. It wasn't a black hole. He literally had a hand punched through his chest. They don't show that. So, especially me being, I remember when it first came out, Dragon Ball in '89, when I first, that was a very long time. And watching it now, I'm like, oh, that happened. And explaining it to parents, like, okay, what you used to see is very different to what it is now. You're seeing the original format, and it's entirely, some of it is edited. But when they have a concern, that's where we come in. And especially with my library, we're very community-based. So I'm like, if you have a question, please ask me. I'm the librarian with the manga tattoos. So I literally know what we're talking about. And also, with some of our branches, we're fortunate enough to have manga on different levels. We have a children's level, we have a young adult level, we have an adult level. And if parents have questions, and we can't tell people what they can or cannot read. That's not our jurisdiction. We're willing to answer questions. However, if there's a book that they have a problem with, I'm like, oh, I'll let you know why it's on this floor instead of on the floor that they're looking. And sometimes it does get complicated because I wish I could order the manga for all of our locations, but we have a separate department that does that. And they have a guide that they have to follow of what follows each age range and what to put in what. So, for example, Demon Slayer, which is hugely popular, is in the teen section. Pokemon, of course, children's. And then you have something like, oh, I'm trying to think of something not too extreme. like anything that is like graphic or explicit, obviously I'm the adult for. And if, I mean, I'll share a semi-funny story that almost gave me a stroke. So I actually had teen, and also this is gonna lead into what I'm gonna say. I had a teen come up to me and they're like, oh, we just read this amazing manga. I'm like, oh, great, I had my coffee. And I was like, what did you read? And they're like, oh, we read 10 Count. That is the most sexually explicit yaoi manga you will ever see. And I nearly choked on my coffee. And I'm like, I just want to let you know the librarian does not endorse what you just read. Please don't ever tell me that again. I will not tell your parents you read that. So we're gonna leave it as is. And actually, I had my anime and manga club today with my teens who were asking me for recommendations. And I'm like, okay, here you go. I'm like, have you read this one? I'm like, you will not read that until you're 18. So as long as we deal with a lot of censorship, but it's like we are willing to talk to parents, give them, that's why we have manga in libraries, which have resources and age-appropriate book lists for educators, readers, you name it.
I think that one of the things that's important is, I think, situating this in kind of the overall social context. And, you know, I've been doing prisoner rights stuff for well over 3 decades now. But I'm also conscious of what's happening outside of the prison context. And I think that, you know, we've seen, and there really hasn't been like some golden age in America for free speech. I mean, you know, campus protests started in the 60s, framed around free speech. The Students for a Free Speech movement were kind of the pivotal ones of that era. And I think, you know, you start thinking about everything from the entertainers like Lenny Bruce to Jim Morrison of the Doors being arrested for obscenity, and even more recently, 2 Live Crew, if anyone remembers them, being prosecuted for obscenity. The Dead Kennedys, one of my favorite bands, they got prosecuted for having a sexually explicit poster in one of their albums. So I think this is all kind of happening. I think it's been happening for a long time. And I think that one of the things that the difference is, and I think just at the overall social level, we're seeing a lot more, I think, a lot more censorship happening now than, I think probably before like the 1970s. I think there was a lot of censorship. It just didn't get much, as much publicity. We seem to have gone through kind of like a little bit of a free speech era, maybe from the 70s and the 80s. But certainly I'd say since at least the 90s, I think we've seen a big increase in censorship. And it's at all spheres of society. I think that if you'd have told someone in, say, 1985, that political protest meant that the police put you in a cage with a sign miles from wherever you were protesting, and no one would see or hear you, constituted a, quote, free speech zone, people thought you were crazy. And then that's kind of accepted as a norm today. And I think that one of the biggest things that's really impacting free speech, what I'm seeing, and I say this as someone who, the Human Rights Defense Center, we litigate a lot of these cases. We've been doing it for a long time. I think the biggest sea change that's affecting all of this has been the change in the judiciary. And I say this in the context that when I was in prison in the 90s, I was pro se, I was representing myself. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not the smartest guy in the world. And I could litigate and win these cases myself against the Attorney General's Office of Washington. And the judges were willing to hear what I had to say. And that is not happening that much now. One of the things that we see now when we bring these cases, we've got big law firms. The cases that Paul Wright could litigate in his prison cell with a budget of, you know, a couple $100 for photocopies and postage. Now when we bring these cases, the out-of-pocket expenses are running tens of thousands of dollars. We've got teams of highly skilled, very trained lawyers from some of the biggest law firms in the country spending hundreds and thousands of hours of legal time litigating these cases. And some of the trends I've seen with, leaving aside the judges that are kind of hostile to the free speech notion and will rule in our favor, one of the things that I've seen that's kind of a bizarre trend in probably the last decade are we win cases, judges find the policies unconstitutional, but they won't issue an injunction saying they can't do it. They're like, well, we're going to issue a ruling saying it's unconstitutional, but we're not going to issue an order prohibiting them from doing it. And that's one of the things that I think is kind of changing. Is I'd say that, you know, in years prior, judges found something unconstitutional, they'd issue an order banning it or enjoining it. And those injunctions don't have a sunset clause or a time clock on them. By issuing the injunction, you know, in theory, they're good until as long as the government is alive to enforce it. But those are, I think, are some of the bigger trends that I think we're seeing. And I think maybe this is also because of the rise of, I think, social media and the internet, where you've got all these private companies that allow for the cancellation of individuals, that allow for, the suppression of speech. Like, I mean, without getting, too sidetracked, it's like whatever you think of Amazon, whether you take the viewpoint that they destroyed the independent bookstores and a lot of the publishing industry and the independent book industry, one of the realities has been, and I say this as a published author, I've published books as well, is that the reality is that if Amazon takes your book off of their system, you are not going to get heard in this country. And it doesn't matter what you have to say. So when you see like the deplatforming of authors, and regardless of what you think about what they have to say, because I see people that I have no opinion on what they say, it seems innocuous to me, but I see that they've been deplatformed, and it's kind of like, wow, the only thing they've got going for them is, they're not super mainstream, they're not super popular, but their voice is being silenced. And this is also affecting everything from comedians. It's a great documentary called Can't Tell a Joke, but Lenny Bruce experienced that. So I think we're seeing the shutdown of whole realms of speech at a lot of levels. And the thing is, it's becoming a lot easier to do this in the age of technology. I forget which book it was, but I think it was George Orwell's 1984, where Amazon removed that from all their Kindle things with the press of a button. If you bought the book, boom, it's gone. Whereas at least in the good old days, if you had a print book, it's sitting on your bookshelf, the police have to come into your home and actually take it off the bookshelf. Now someone sitting in a control center in Seattle or Dallas or wherever can do that with the press of a button. And I think these are kind of a lot of the ways that I think we're seeing wide increases in censorship. And one of the things that I also think is also amplifying. I mean, when I see this thing about these people calling for the censorship of books in libraries and things like that, I kind of find, where's anyone in the government with a backbone to say, hey, we don't let 2 or 3 whack jobs dictate what's in our library for all the citizens. I'm not seeing any government officials standing up to this. Maybe I'm missing it, but I mean, I do follow this stuff pretty closely. I'm not seeing anyone in government saying, hey, enough is enough. You're entitled to your opinions, but you don't get to dictate your opinions. You don't get to impose your beliefs on everyone else. And I think these are some of the bigger sea changes I think that we're seeing kind of at the macro level, above and beyond just the specifics of the library censorship the prison censorship, that's been going on a long time. There's no oversight, there's very little transparency. But the stuff in the community, in theory, is supposed to have more, and I'm just not seeing it.
Let's go a little bit specific about the topic of manga and then race related. Do you think there are xenophobic and maybe racist biases behind high rates of manga censorship, even though, like Paul said, it's a small bit of the large number of censored books, but the data set I have collected shows that there are enormous amount of manga books, especially after 2010 or something, pretty recent, before there weren't even manga exists there in prison censorship too. And that if so, how might xenophobic and then racist biases inform the ways that US censors evaluate depictions of women's nudity in manga? That's also based on my observation. In many books which are censored or shows female nudity in general, male bodies are barely censored, or naked male bodies are not that easy to find, actually. So do you have any answers?
My quick comment on this, I think this falls squarely into the context of the hostility towards anything to do with racial empowerment, civil rights, or even the notion of human rights, even the notion that people in prison have human rights, or even that they're human. I mean, this is crazy talk in the prison context. And I think you have to follow it through is if the chattel starts to think they're human and they think they have a right to be treated other than the way, however, the people treating them want to, the consequences from that, well, that's why we have social change in this world and why we have for thousands of years. So I would posit that censorship is just squarely in line with all the other stuff. The hostility towards any type of sexual speech, that's been going on for, for decades. And I think there's this police state notion that by locking people in cages, you're somehow shutting down or shutting off human sexuality. And, there's a saying in Mexico that you can't shut out the sun with your thumb. And, and I think that's one of those, that might be some wishful thinking. And, but that is the wishful thinking. And one of the things one of my talking points for a long time used to be that for a subset of Americans, of evangelical Christians, that maybe they can't keep all Americans from having abortions, and maybe they can't keep all Americans from looking at porn, but by golly, they were going to do it over the Americans they had control over, which was the ones they'd locked in cages. And well, now they are trying to keep all Americans from getting abortions, and they're also working hard on keeping everyone else from having access to sexual content or sexual speech. And yeah, like I said, they just seem to be happy with whatever gains they can get and just trundle along. And it takes them decades to do stuff, but they are getting results.
Yeah, it just makes me think of like one of my teens who was 13, and she said, "You know what? Thank God for the internet. If I can't find it here, I'll find it on the internet." And I'm like, "That is so true. You can find anything on the internet." And before they try to take that away from us, and it is just so crazy, especially there was a term that a good friend of mine, a colleague, Dr. Joe Sanchez of Queens College, and he talked about the browning of America. If anyone is familiar with that term, this happened during the George Floyd riots. So this is where more of this fear has come in. So it's like, okay, we're gonna keep trying to silence more of these voices, not just with manga, but all of our literature. We have, I'm trying not to mention a particular book because we haven't released our list yet, but we have, we know it's going to be banned because it talks about recovering from SA from an authority figure. And it was a person of color and how they handle it. And we're we just know that book is going to be banned just because of those things alone. And it's just one of those major fights that we just continuing to, and we're not gonna stop fighting. We're I know I'm not, I'm a total activist. So it gets really daunting that, especially with sexual health, that our teens need, because they're gonna, heaven forbid, anything that they find, they're gonna find it on the streets and not get the proper resources. That's the last thing I want. It's and this is also when you target libraries, you're targeting a safe haven for our youth to be themselves, especially our LGBTQ youth, because some of them are not out at their families. I have teens that are still in the closet, but they are themselves with me because I'm this is your spot, this is your space. And it also being a queer person of color myself. And it's I understand exactly how you feel. And I'm in my 40s, and just now I've been out for 2 years. And that's a struggle. That is such a struggle. And I understand that. It's now they're becoming more aware of the world around them, and now it's being shut down. So it's we continue to make sure that they get their resources any way they can that is not a total lie, that is not based on falsehoods, and that's not going to be endangering them. So we just keep doing what we do.
Manga presents a particularly interesting challenge when it comes to protecting manga in local communities, because I think there's certain aspects of it that when you say that people who aren't familiar with comics, they're not familiar with manga, if they are a little bit scared by comics and the combination of word and image, they're really, really put off by this strange thing that's just showed up in their shelves and kids and adults are reading. So first of all, you read the things backwards, right? And a bunch of them would have English on the cover, even in part, or maybe just in part. They're cartoonish, but they're read by adults. And a number of them have sexual imagery or themes that in the culture of manga are very, very normal, just part of the landscape. There are going to be some manga that have it, a lot of manga that don't. But they look at it and they put it all in a big bucket, right? And so if you find a few images in a few books that have a problem, or a genre like hentai or something like that that has it, they're like, well, of course, if I've seen this octopus doing this in a hentai, and you have a little octopus in Pokemon, they're all together there in some way in some people's minds, which is why they're saying let's get rid of the whole thing. When you add to that the revolution in civil rights, and people just want to, manga is really, Marshall McLuhan, media theorist Marshall McLuhan said comics are participatory medium. People just don't want to read them, they want to be part of them in some way. They want to write them, create them, dress like them, collect the toys, whatever. It's a very democratic medium. Well, manga especially more so. Kids look at that manga and say, I can draw that, I can do that. And I think that people are afraid because you have people looking at it and saying, you know what? My identity is now protected by civil rights law. My identity is now protected by the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. I am a citizen. This is the new civics. And they want to represent themselves. They want to tell their story. And they're going to tell it in words and images. And for many kids and adults, they want to do it through manga. And again, people seeing sex, cartoon, and that's why you get this groomer discourse going on around manga, which is really, really troubling and hard to fight.
I just want to add one thing, especially with manga.
Yeah.
People forget there's such a, like as you mentioned, it's such a wonderful escapism from the real world. It's amazing. And now I also want to plug a publication that's been out for almost a decade, and I love what they do. They're called Saturday AM, and they were at our Day of Manga. They are a BIPOC-owned manga-influenced publication. So they use their influence of manga and draw stories reflecting all kinds of diverse backgrounds. And we're so appreciative that it's like finally we have something that looks like us that's not like, so we're not stereotypically drawn.
Mm-hmm.
And also we have manga that will teach you, we have something that's called the Manga Guide series that teach you like physics, it teaches you calculus, it teaches history. We have manga that teaches you how to be an entrepreneur. And so this is how amazing manga is. And it's like, oh, it's all this smut. It's like, it's really not. I'm like, I actually plugged a manga called Bocchi the Rock. So, and it's about a girl with social anxiety. We got mental wellness being portrayed, which is rarely done. So it's like, it's much more than, oh my God, we got tentacle porn.
Yeah, thanks for that, Renee. I think that's really important to remember. And I think what, for me, I hadn't considered as much coming from this conversation too, is just not only the kind of xenophobic and fear of the other, the strangeness aspect of manga, but also the popularity and power that it holds, which is also a motivator for then suppressing it.
Remember, I can remember anyway, when you started getting toys from Japan or cars from Japan, the stuff that you would see on TV would be shocking to people now, because some they were not seen as good things. They were seen. There's a Mad Men episode you can see where there's a reaction to Honda coming in for an ad campaign that's emblematic of a phenomenon that I think, particularly for younger people today, if you look back in the 60s and 70s and how we reacted to the most normal things from Japan, you would be shocked.
That's really interesting. Now some of my colleagues and I joke that at Pratt, the period styles like anime and manga in terms of just what people default to when drawing the human body. So yeah, it all really resonates. in our conversation too, I've heard the internet and social media come up, and so thinking about censorship, publication, and distribution from that angle is something we've touched on. But I also want to think about the uses and abuses of digital technologies, especially in the public education system and prisons as well. What are your biggest concerns about digitizing publications and digital reading devices? We've touched on some already. How do these affect access to and ownership of reading material? What about digital censors replacing human ones? And also to then think beyond just the gloom and doom possibilities, progressive possibilities for technology and combating censorship biases and obstacles. So I just threw a lot out there. Feel free to pick up any of it or anything proximate that resonates.
Well, on the prison front, it's real easy. Prisoners don't have access to the internet, not legally. The only thing I say is, it's a good thing that there's so many contraband cell phones, and a lot of the thing around cell phones in prisons, prison officials had to believe that every prisoner wants a cell phone so they can carry out illegal activities. The reality is most prisoners want their cell phones so that they can communicate with their family at reasonable rates and also have access to the same information on the internet that other people do. I mean, all the prisoners on Facebook is one of the things that I find kind of amazing, but hey, I guess everyone wants to be on Facebook. One of the things I think we're seeing right now, we've got at least 2 states. We're suing the state of Missouri. They're using the excuse of digitizing their mail as an excuse to ban all books and magazines. New Mexico has done that as well. So I think we're seeing kind of a bigger trend of prisons and jails banning all publications under the guise that somehow they're digitizing stuff. The reality is when we start looking, the fact that we're in a library here, I have to say, is one of my pet peeves right now is everyone here familiar with the Gutenberg Project? Okay, the Gutenberg Project, they're a nonprofit. They're taking books that are in the public domain, they're digitizing them, they make them available for free. One of the prison telecom companies, it's called ViaPath, they used to be known as Global Tellink. They take these free public domain books off the Gutenberg Project, put them on tablets, and then charge prisoners and their families $10 a piece to read the books in the public domain. And this is one of those, in a world rife with injustice and economic exploitation, that's one of the ones I really find annoying. But the fact is that they're not making anything, as far as I can tell, they're not making anything available on these tablets that criticize the government, that question anything to do with civil rights or human rights or anything like that. And the trend is, I think, towards making everything, watering it down to be as innocuous as possible. And go onto the Gutenberg Project and look at the titles that are available, and plenty of good books. But that said, nothing that's really critical of the government, because they weren't really criticizing the government before the 1920s in ways that are on there. And so I think that's one of the things we're seeing, these clampdowns. They're using digitization as a tool to censor any and all criticism, further isolate and alienate prisoners. And the thing is, I was on Amazon the other day, and I think they say they've got 43 million titles available for books. And they got 70,000 titles available from the Gutenberg Project on these tablets. And not that anyone's, they're not willing to pay for the content. So I think that's how we're seeing this kind of manifest itself in the prison and jail context. I think this is going to intensify. They use the excuse to trying to keep drugs out of prisons and jails as the excuse for banning mail. The reality is most drugs are brought into prisons and jails by the staff members, by their own employees. Even after they've banned all mail, the drug overdoses and deaths continue unabated. So there's not really much of a correlation there. So I think it's probably, if anything else, it's going to be worsening. And so far, I'd say the internet, or I shouldn't call it the internet because it isn't, but digitization is just promising to be a bigger, firmer tool of censorship and any type of critique for the American police state in its prisons and jails.
We're doing a little bit of an opposite of that. So New York Public Library is actually doing an active promotion, which is called Ban Books for All. So every single challenged book is available through our Simply E, or you can go through Libby, and it's free. And we don't believe in censorship in any form, and this is what we can do to constantly combat that. We also work with our publications, such as Kodansha, to promote their works. And they also, I like telling my students, like, you can read chapters for free on their websites. And so we have Kodansha, Viz Media, Manga Plus. We will refer them to those. Like, if you want to read it now, they're right there on the internet for you. And we also provide those links for them. We're also working with getting digital rights to put them onto our Simply platforms. So we don't have a lot, but we're still working on it just to make sure that they get the reading that they want, not just what they need, what they want, because we want to make it fun. Reading should be not just educational, it should be fun and something for them to find stories that they relate to, and they're like, I like this is telling my story, this is how I feel comfortable. And even like, especially with manga, I have so many people tell me, why aren't they reading real books? I'm like, they are real books. I'm sorry. It's like, oh, why don't you have them read Moby Dick? I'm like, I didn't even read Moby Dick. Why are you telling me this? It's like, this is a real book, and you should be happy that they're reading. And not everyone's gonna have the same reading comprehension. I mean, I didn't even finish Moby Dick. I fell asleep.
I made it to page 40.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like just because it's not your reading level, just be happy that they're reading at all.
People are scared by lots of things. We've talked about how people are scared by what's different. They're also scared by what's big. And the internet is big. It scales up all of the things that they may have been metaphorically going bump in the night for people who are afraid of images, representations of sexuality and sexual identity, that sort of thing. And it's like, they see it as everywhere. And so they respond by thinking that they need to take more efforts to stop it, particularly in the digital sphere. So for example, you were talking about the work you're doing with expanding access. Connecticut has responded to that sort of thing in terms of giving more access digitally by passing a law that says providing online digital communications to children that are deemed patently offensive by a community. Doesn't forget about literary, artistic, political, scientific value. That's not part of the standard. Patently offensive. That can be a criminal offense. So, and that's not, we're not talking about, South Carolina or Mississippi. We're talking Connecticut, Metro North is where this is happening. And something similar has happened with payment providers. We've got to really be concerned about for manga, because there's pressure on payment providers in the US, as well as from a number of countries, to make it impossible to purchase things that have these explicit images. So you could find entire publishers cut off from being able to have Visa, PayPal, MasterCard, Venmo, just blocked from having access to crowdfunding sites. That is a real thing. It is a real danger, and we encounter stories. One of the biggest questions we get is how do we counter being taken off the internet, or not being able to use PayPal, or not being able to use Visa, and that's a very interesting thing to have to deal with. In prisons, which in a way, remember we talked about the similarity to schools, we gotta catch up. Prisons for years, they kind of suited themselves to the industry of America. There's this, you could say it was fiction, but at least there was something there. Where they said, we're going to rehabilitate people by giving them skills. They can make garments, they can work on an assembly line, and they can learn that, or they can apprentice themselves to somebody who fixes windows or something. And then they can go out in the real world and have a job, and then we'll cut on going back. But what's happening now, of course, they're preparing them for a society that doesn't exist. The only way a number of the people who are learning these skills in prison can use them is to get in a time machine and go back to 1950. Particularly in New York, where just a lot of the factories, this used to be a factory city, and they're gone. So we give them no tools. By excluding them from the internet, they have no tools. They are not learning how to be literate in contemporary society. Imagine if we used digitized manga, digitized graphic novels, digitized instructional material, which I absolutely love. I wrote some notes on that. And people use the time in prison to learn. Imagine if they learned how to code games, design games. There's a lot of stuff you can just plug and play in designing games now. It's not just hard code. You don't really have to be super mathematically inclined to build some basic things. You could give people skills for life. And yes, people are worried about the gangs using it in secret code and all that stuff. Well, look, you can use AI to identify those patterns, to flag it, assess it, cut it down. We can identify the worst activity much more quickly and much more effectively than we ever could with physical mail. So why not do it? Why not give prisoners the tools so that they don't feel like they're just ostracized from society forever, that the whole world is a prison for the rest of their life?
Yeah, really appreciate that range of perspectives, and to bring in even more, we wanted to invite the audience, you all, to ask any questions you might like. We have some more questions we can pose, but we're eager to hear from you and for that dialogue to take hold. So anyone want to pose? Yeah.
Okay. My question is for each of you three panelists, and I'm interested from each of you, what is your favorite manga that you would absolutely advocate for these, for those who are incarcerated and don't have, who may be affected by these bans?
You go, because I got a list that will probably take up the rest of the time.
I would actually pull together a selection of stories by Junji Ito, because they're such powerful metaphors of alienation and connection that I think somebody could see themselves in that story and also start thinking about how. And it's also fun stuff by Junji Ito as well. Think about how we can connect, but also how we can deal with disconnection, how we can deal with the sense of being haunted by something we don't understand. Whenever there was a new book that just came out today. And so that's what I was reading on the train out here. It's just, yeah, I can show you. Do you mind if I, but anyway, I really do have it here. Yeah, so it just came out in English.
They have a good collection of Junji Ito upstairs, by the way, here. I just saw 3 of them together.
I know it's on my phone. So I'll pull it out real quick. I'm sorry.
And I agree, they're cathartic.
Yeah, they're incredibly cathartic. And it also helps overcome this sense that, I don't think I read this while I'm pulling this up. Mimi's Tales of Terror just came out. Today. You can get it on Amazon digitally. It's instant download. But there's this quote from this amazing case where the prison had banned a whole bunch of books, and the case went on for years, except for the manga books. It was several volumes of Pretty Face. And with respect to manga, every time it was considered by the district court or the appellate court, they basically reached this conclusion. This is a quote from the case. It's called Cisney versus Kaming. This is from 2020. It continued for a little while after that. Manga comics, that's the heading in the opinion. The comic books are not good literature, or even close to it. That is not the question. The comic books have sophomoric situations which do have a sexual tone. And then it goes on talking about how dumb these manga are.
That's the headline?
That's from a court opinion. And if you had something like Junji Ito, there's no way you can look at that and say that's sophomoric in tone. There's no way. That is freaking literature to the max. That is more literature than many American ghost stories. It's Washington Irving. times 20, you know, in terms of it's the headless horseman multiplied. So that would be my recommendation. As you can tell, I'm kind of passionate about that.
I'd say there really is no one, and I say this in the context that, you know, I'm a free speech guy, and I think that what people find individual meaning to is just that, it's individual. And one of the things that, towards the tail end of my sentence, I was in a minimum security camp, and I wound up with a job as the recreation assistant and also the librarian. And the library, we actually had a lot of books that had been donated by local libraries and stuff like that. And I kind of think that, you know, my biggest contribution to the prison librarianship there was I pulled all the romance novels out of general fiction and created their own section because I was tired of walking up and down the aisles shelving the books. And one of the things, and I guess I'm not a romance fan myself, but I found when I'm working in the prison library that literally the most popular books by genre in the prison library were romance novels. And the thing is, and I guess it's one of those things that, you know, I think people have a lot of stereotypes. And I think that, you know, and when you see kind of like, you know, the tatted up gangbangers and bikers coming in, hey, Paul, is the Danielle Steele back in yet? And no, man, I'll hold, as soon as it comes in, I'll hold on to it. If I see you in the chow hall, I'll let you know we got it. Okay, bro, thanks. And I think that that's one of those things that, you know, I mean, the stuff that I filed lawsuits over when I was in prison, I think I'm probably the last person in America filing lawsuits over their ability to get communist literature. And the prisons were censoring that. I was trying to get books like, you know, with titles like Main Currents of Marxism, Lenin's State and Revolution, and stuff. And this is in the early 90s. And the Attorney General's office is fighting tooth and nail against this. And we have a court hearing. I'm representing myself. And the judge, Judge Justin Quackenbush, he's still on the bench. He must be 1,000,000 years old because he was appointed by President Carter. And he's like, you know, he's asking the Attorney General's office, you know, well, counsel, what's the problem here? Why can't Mr. Wright have these books? Well, Your Honor, they advocate the armed overthrow of the U.S. government. Really? And counsel, the United States won the Cold War. The Soviet Union no longer exists. What's the harm if Mr. Wright has these books in his maximum security prison cell? Well, I'm not really sure, Your Honor. I think I got to talk to my client. He's like, well, you talk to your client, but I'm inclined to rule in Mr. Wright's favor, and he did. And I think, but that's I think the things that, you know, what people find meaning of I think is going to vary. And that's the thing, it's a very individualized thing. I've taught prisoners how to read. I've done the literacy stuff and for adult basic education. And I think that somehow some people might have this lofty idea that, hey, this guy can't read, and somehow if we teach them to read, they're going to be reading the lofty works of Shakespeare or, you know, or whatever. The reality is, hey, you know, people maybe wants to read romance novels, or manga, you know, or whatever. But the thing is, I think that that's just it, though. What's important to the individual is just that. You know, it's not for anyone to dictate that, hey, this is the person that should be reading this, or I'm going to sit here and tell everyone else what everyone should be reading. What I am going to, actually, I'm going to take that back. I am going to tell you, you should be reading prison legal news and criminal legal news. We got free copies on the back shelf there, so take up. So yeah, I will tell you to read my stuff. So, but you know, but I think, that's why I think though that when you talk to people about, and I think everyone that's a reader, everyone that reads books, I think that right now, if you were asked, like, you know, what's been the most important or transformational book, or what do you think the most inspiring book for you was that you've read, you're going to get a different opinion from everyone. If you have 100 people in a room, you're probably not going to get an identical answer out of 100 people. Everyone's going to have their own thing. A lot of stuff depends on, you know, where you're at in your life when you read stuff. Like, I think that, like, I get asked a question like, you know, well, when did you get interested in prisoner rights? Well, when I went to prison. And it's like, okay, fair enough. And I think that's like, you know, a lot of GLBT people. When did you get interested in GLBT rights? Right around the time I realized I was GLBT, you know, whatever. And I think that that's, I think that that's one of the things is that it's so subjective and so individual, but I also think this is the very reason that I think that the right to read and the right to access information is so important and so vital as a human right, as a basic fundamental human right. Because of that, it's not enough to say that, hey, we're going to let you read the 70,000 books that the Gutenberg Project has put online that we can get for free and charge you for, because, okay, what if I'm not interested in that? And I don't think that, and I think that one of the things, I think when Jeff is reading out that passage from the judge is obviously hostile to Manga, but you know what? Who cares? It's not the judge's position to say, if this has, if it's meeting his or her standards of, high literature or whatever. And I think that that's one of the things that gets lost in this is, the First Amendment isn't about the right to read, whatever someone in the positions of authority or power thinks is appropriate or whatever. It comes down to, reading what the author has to say and what you want to read. And I think that's the big thing is, the First Amendment means we don't have the government gatekeeper telling us what's fit for the masses. And if someone wants to read Danielle Steele, if they want to read Manga, if they want to read Paul Wright, hey, more power to them. So
I trimmed down my list a little bit. So, so I think, especially with acceptance, because with a lot of prisoners, they're looking for acceptance because they're trying to rehabilitate themselves. And I actually it made me think of, because I used to do jail and prison services for Rikers Island. So we would go do our library services there. And this book made me think of one prisoner because he was like, I don't know if my parents are going to accept me because I found my identity, which was he's a gay man. And it made me think of this recently new manga. It's called I Think Our Son Is Gay. And it's such a beautiful story of a mother who can tell that her son has affections for his best friend who's male. And it's just her waiting for him to feel comfortable to come out to her so she can support him. But she's like, I'm waiting for him on his own terms and on his own time to feel ready to be open to me and just support him. So I thought that was such a beautiful manga. And also, speaking of romance, I just did a review for this. It's called The Moon on a Rainy Night, which is one of the most beautiful mangas I have read in such a long time. I cannot wait for volume 2, about 2 high school girls who meet in a chance encounter, and one of them has a disability. She's hard of hearing, but she's not completely deaf. So in a way, she's in her own prison because she can't understand what people are saying. She can read lips, but she doesn't do JSL. And she's coddled by her teachers because she can't hear them. Other students isolate her, and she has her own walls put up. And they feel like, okay, well, she's ignoring us, she's snobbish. But her name is Kanon, and Saki, who actually witnesses an act of kindness from her, realizes she is not that person at all. So she reaches out to her, and they build a friendship that becomes a slow burn romance. It is so beautiful, and the best part about it, and I was telling my fellow manga readers, it's like, you know what the best part about this girl's love story is? They're like, what? There's no excessive fan service. It's about their relationship. We're not seeing that. So it was such a beautiful story, which I highly recommend.
That's new, by the way.
It is. Yes, it is.
I think we have time. Yep. Yeah, sure.
Hi. Okay. Thank you for this panel. It's really informative. I saw the banned book list that the Marshall Project put out of all the books that were banned in state prisons, and I've also seen the press around Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe, and I was wondering, is it easier for prisons and parents to ban individual titles, or is it easier for them to just say like no explicit images because it's more general, and are there like different strategies for why they do that?
I could take from like a parent standpoint. If it's something that they're not used to, they're like, I don't want my child reading it. And it's like, okay, unfortunately, we can't control what's in the household. but we can't control what's in the library. And what I have done, and I'm outing myself, hi, I will actually hold the book on the side for them. And also what we do as part of our library policy, that we have a checkbox on the application when teens get their library cards, that we do not disclose to their parents what they have checked out, because they have rights to.
In the prison context, we've seen plenty of hostility towards GLBT texts. The state of Indiana, in a pretty atrocious opinion around 15 years ago, a federal judge there upheld a ban on The Advocate and Out magazine, which in my mind are about as innocuous and vanilla as you get as far as GLBT publications go. And they upheld that. They did not. I'm friends with the attorney that brought the case. And in fact, he's represented HRDC in our censorship cases in Indiana. And they didn't appeal it because they're afraid it was going to get upheld by the appellate court. And so you've seen kind of these, and one of the worst things that you see from prison censors, what they use in that case, rather than say, hey, we're a bunch of homophobic bigots and we're using state power to impose our discriminatory beliefs on others, they claim that they're doing this to protect the prisoners. That, well, if other prisoners know that the prisoner's gay and they're getting a gay publication, they'll be subject to targeting and they'll be physically endangered. So we're just doing this to protect them. And that's like kind of BS, because one of the first things that I was told when I got to prison by the prison intelligence officer's standard speech to everyone arriving at the prison was, there are no secrets in prison. If you break the rules, I will find out about it. I don't think that Jim found out about everything, but there really aren't a lot of secrets in prison. And so the fact that they're using this as an argument, and sadly it carried the weight to convince one judge to uphold a ban on all GLBT publications in the state of Indiana. But the fact that it gains that level of currency, but you do see these levels of censorship, and that said, it also kind of depends on where you're at. One of the sad commentaries I've made, we litigate all over the country. I've lived, since I got out of prison, I've lived in various places. How many rights you have as an American really depends on where you live. And that's the same thing as being a prisoner. If you live in the 9th Circuit, you've probably got more rights as a prisoner than you do in the 11th Circuit. And frankly, the bottom line is that all the states of the former Confederacy, south of the Mason-Dixon line, they're probably not that great. And I say this as someone who lives in Florida. But your rights, you really don't have a lot of rights against the government as people in other parts of the country do, or say even here in New York that you do. And so as far as, the censorship of GLBT material, you're seeing a lot of it in a lot of places. Other places like California, Washington, here in New York, not so much. But I'd say that's more of a political decision and that's also one of the things too, though, is I think that places that have well-organized activists and stuff like that. Like here in New York, if the New York DOC said tomorrow, we're going to ban all GLBT publications, the governor's office is going to be hearing about it. Your legislative, folks are going to be in on the act. There's a lot of advocacy groups here. Everyone's going to get in on the act, and that ban is not going to last very long. They've done this in Florida for decades, and everyone's okay with it. And I think that's kind of the difference, I think, where things are at. It's not so much even is it legal or not, but can they also get away with it politically? And that's kind of our reality of where we're at.
Just in terms of whether it's easier to challenge or easier to prevail, and thankfully a lot of challenges don't win. But one of the things that set this off, I think the thing that set this off, is the fact that pictures are powerful. And so, Conflict Legal Defense Fund has been dealing with this issue for decades. And by the teens, it had pretty much trickled. There wasn't a year without them, but it wasn't a big thing. And then when the images of genderqueer were shown on YouTube from a school board meeting, it went viral. And there were things here in New York. There were things here in Connecticut. There are things all over the country because what what taking these pictures out of context did is it sort of wiped away what had been a consensus since the Miller test for obscenity, where the Supreme Court says you got to look at this, take everything as a whole. You can't just. All right. Okay. So you can't just cut scenes out of a movie. You have to look at the work as a whole, right? So what people are now doing is they're taking the images and putting them on YouTube, putting them at school board meetings, putting them on the floor of legislatures, and then saying, let's just toss obscenity laws protections against abuse, and then just target anything that has any of these images in it, because they're cartoons, and cartoons are for kids, and we just got to wipe this stuff off the face of the earth.
I think we can take one more question at least.
I really appreciate this. Thank you all so much for this. A couple things came up sort of obliquely or tangentially while you were talking. And I think one was, Renee, I think you gestured towards the Kids Online Safety Act. And I think this question asker next to me was really getting at the proliferation of like long lists of book challenges by advocacy groups on the far right. And both of those are sort of related to broader policy issues that are being pushed by a really small subset of actors. And I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about how that stuff is part and parcel of this and or, you know, its own thing.
Especially with these groups, it has been a challenge, especially we're trying to be open for everybody because our model is libraries are for everyone, not for this particular group. And it has been a challenge. Thankfully, we haven't had much pushback because we're a well-known library system. But we see what everyone else is going through, and it hurts us. And we try to support our fellow librarians. Even at ALA, I actually had the pleasure of seeing Judy Blume speak. And her books have always been challenged. And she even said, this is so ridiculous. And so much to the point, she won't even acknowledge that she lives in Florida. She's like, I live in Key West, which is in, she's like, no, I'm not from Florida, I live in Key West, which is in that state. Yeah. That's what she says. And she is so like amazing, and she understands what we all go through. And I just say, like, with all this pushback, we just keep going because we don't believe in censorship. We believe in intellectual freedom, and especially with our kids, that we refuse, especially being a community library, we refuse to have anyone silenced. And we're mostly a community of color as well, and we have seen so much hostility. And it's just that we keep fighting the good fight. We keep providing those books. We'll keep buying those books, even though like we're facing another budget cut, which I probably not, I'm just gonna say it anyway, I don't care. We're facing another budget cut, but we're not gonna stop our work. And even I'm going to continue promoting the library as a safe space, that you're gonna get the information that you not just need, but you deserve, because everyone deserves access to all the information they need. And whether they're young or not, I mean, they're afraid like, oh, if I ban this, they're not gonna have sex work. They're going to. I hate to say it. Whatever, they're gonna find it on the internet. They're gonna find it out on the streets. I'd rather they get their education at the library, not at the streets. And this is how we're keeping them not just safe, but alive as well. So we're just gonna continue fighting, keep providing those books. I'm gonna keep requesting those books. And when you see our best books for teens list, I hope you all love them, because we worked really hard to make sure everybody was represented.
Just want to say one sentence, and I think because of the time, and that is, I think that the attacks are so fierce because the attackers sense that they've already lost. Yeah. The culture is leaving them behind.
I'd say at least in the prison context, I think it's just, you know, I think it's just part of the overall clampdown that we see by the American police state on any minoritarian views. and reinforcing the status quo and, denigrating the notion of individual rights and human rights at every level. And for that, they didn't really need a lot of outside encouragement. Like, they're already on that path on their own. And unfortunately, they're not getting a lot of pushback on it.
Well, we're pushing back by having
Yes.
this conversation. I hope you feel that. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming. I don't know if you want to give our panelists a round of applause.
I just like to say, if anyone's interested in both free speech stuff and what's going on in prisons and jails, check out our website, prisonlegalnews.org. We also cover criminal legal news and criminallegalnews.org as well. We've got the magazines back there, and also you can follow us on social media as well. We put stuff out there. And anyways, we're still fighting the good fight, so